Be a state. Perform the basic functions of a state, a grown-up state. Don't sit there in North Block making excuses to the tune of 1 lakh crores 1 year after you have miserably failed in your task.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Inquiry. Over the last few days, there's been a lot of discussion about Budget 2022, but it's still crucial to ask, what are some of the deeper messages it holds about the economy and the path India is on? A recent Oxfam report had some stark figures. The income of the bottom 1/5 of India's population has plunged by a staggering 53% in the last 5 years. 50% of India's population holds just 6% of its wealth. In contrast, the top 10% of India's population holds 57% of its wealth, and just the top 100 richest Indians' wealth went up to 57 lakh crore. No society can be called healthy if prosperity is not shared. So is the government doing enough to design a shared prosperity? To discuss this question, I have one of India's most respected economists, a former member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council, and the Managing Director of the Overseas Development Institute, Rathin Roy, with me on the show today. Thank you very much for joining me on Inquiry, Rathin.
Thank you, Shobha. Pleasure to be here.
So, Rathin, let me start. We're a couple of days late to discuss the economy and the budget, largely because I completely lost my voice. But what I was really keen to ask you is that, Mr. P.T.R. Thiagarajan, Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu, he wrote a column where he said that the budget actually is a statement of principle and priorities, So even before you go into all the nitty-gritties of what it says, it actually is about the vision statement of a government. So what do you think this budget really says about the Modi administration? What are its principles and priorities for this country?
I think PTR made a very good point. There are three words you use there: principles, priorities, and future. Let me first start by saying that this budget and the one before it have abandoned the word future. They are not framed with the future in mind. To frame a coherent professional statement about the future in a budget or any fiscal policy or any policy document is very different from throwaway comments, in the House. So saying that this is a blueprint for 25 years or India is a glorious country or $5 trillion is not a professional comment on the future. So a professional comment on the future, as I see it and used to exist in India till fiscal year 2020, is if I ask the government of India or the Ministry of Finance or anybody, the postulars in Niti Aayog, what is India's GDP going to be in 2025? Please tell me. What's going to be the structure of my economy? What percentage of it will come from agriculture? What percentage from industry? What percentage from services? What are you going to do about, and then if they had answers to these, I would ask them slightly more complicated questions like, what will be the current account deficit? Will India close its balance of payments deficit? Will India be a bigger exporter? By how much? And you'd see they would refer me to a document. Years ago, I had an embarrassment of riches. I had planned documents. I had long-term policies, such as long-term fiscal policy. And I had the budget, which had a statement of medium-term macroeconomic policy and a medium-term fiscal policy, which was released since 2003. And my grouse then is that these don't cohere or match. But now I don't have a plan. Something was released by Niti Aayog, vision statement, 5 years, 7 years. Even they have forgotten what it means. It's not even on their website. Okay? And last thing to go was those two medium-term fiscal statements in the budget. For the last 2 years, they have just not abandoned it. So the answer to that kind of question coming from a professional as opposed from a posturer would be, I don't know. I have no document in the government of India which tells me what we are going to be looking like even 4 years from now. So much for the future. Now, if that is your view of the future, then let me talk about principles and policies. Well, the message I get of principle from this budget is let me put it in the nicest way possible. In terms of principles and the other stuff, PTR was, so we have got the future out of the way. This government has no idea what's going to happen. It's very clear to me in 2 years' time, let alone in 5 or 10 years' time. Other than talk. Talk is very cheap. I have no time for talk.
I'll come back with some of the rebuttals that, sadly nowadays we never have conversations where like two very knowledgeable minds, maybe from across the aisles, will even agree to come and sit together. So I'll play back some of the stuff they might say if they were here, but I want to hear your perspective first.
All right, no, I'd love to do that because I don't see how you can contest the fact that there is no official statement in any government document about where India will be in 2025 in terms of growth. Basic stuff, balance of payments, fiscal deficit, and economic structure. Nothing, zero, zilch, anda. So that's not contestable. So if they have to say something, I don't know, Vishwaguru or something, I'm quite prepared for this. I'm just looking for a number, modest guy. Like most economists, like just want the number.
Well, I mean, the big headline one they do always is the 5 trillion economy.
That's not a number. That is a Soviet aspiration. So tomorrow, if I say to you, I'm running a government and I say India will produce 5 million tractors in 2029, that's a blathering statement unless it's backed by something. Can't just say that. The absurdity of the 5 million is the new chief economic advisor himself said that. He said it depends on the exchange rate. So let's have a policy where I increase the exchange rate to 40 rupees to a dollar, you'll get 5 trillion. So, that's what I mean. I have no time for this kind of posturing nonsense, which passes for economic policy making in this government, regrettably. So let's go back to so here let me say something nice, so I don't doubt the government would think it is. I think the government of India has finally admitted to what I've been saying for the last 3 or 4 years, that the Ministry of Finance is not competent to perform the most basic functions of the state, which is to raise the revenues it says it will raise and to manage public assets the way it says it will manage. Consistently for the last 3 or 4 years, revenues numbers have fallen at least 1 to 1.5% below what the government targeted. Okay. Last year, taking advantage of the pandemic, the government brought down its revenue ambitions by over 2% of GDP. And this year they have mildly overtaken it in the revised estimates, which is the next estimate after the budget estimate. But in next year's plan, they have pegged the revenue at even lower than the revised estimate. This reflects to me an acknowledgement of incompetence and more seriously a loss of morale. Now there are more complicated things in that slight overshooting of revenue that happened this year. Do you know that a lot of it happened because of GST? And a lot of it happened in GST because we imported, because GST on imports went up. So what are we saying? Are we saying that we will need to have a worsening current account? This is serious economics, not rubbish. To increase our revenues. If the main source of your revenue overshoot has been a rise in imports and taxation on imports, then is that the government's premise? When they congratulate themselves on revenues having gone up? If so, I'd like to hear them say it. So there is that. On disinvestment, I am particularly exercised. Last year, the government put in a target of 1.75 lakh crores for disinvestment. I wrote repeatedly that they wouldn't achieve even a fraction of this, not because they don't want to, that's not the issue. They don't have the competence to disinvest. Hindi mein bolte hai, औकात या क्षमता नहीं है इनका. They are a broken, decrepit, low capacity ministry. And a broken, decrepit, low capacity ministry cannot handle disinvestments of 1,75,000 crores. And what happens this year? They managed to get 75,000 crores, which I then discover, thanks to a very honest finance secretary, includes LIC, which is not finished. And whether it will finish or not is touch and go. So even that modest 75,000 crores they have got includes something on spec, which is not yet done. And on top of that, they have paid about 50,000 crores. They've taken on that Air India debt on budget. So if LIC doesn't come through and you take that debt on, their disinvestment is negative. And nobody is accountable. The minister is not accountable. The secretary is not accountable. The government is not accountable for a whole of 1,50,000 crores. Can I take a finance ministry that gets its numbers so badly wrong? Seriously. And of course, next year, what they've done is they've moderated it to 65,000 crores. Now, moderation is one thing as a statement of incompetence from a government, and it is wise for a hubristic government to admit incompetence, but it is not good enough for me. I'm not willing to accept, as a citizen of this country and a professional economist, permanent incompetence in the Ministry of Finance. And the biggest signal I get from this budget is long-term, continual incompetence of the Ministry of Finance. The only saving grace is they have finally admitted it to us and to themselves, surrounded by a lot of big talk. So that's the second signal I get from this budget.
Okay. So, Rathin, I'll come back to some of this, like the issue, you've pointed out the professional sort of discrepancies between stated desire and what is accomplished. I was asking you for so I'll come back to this, the issues about taxes, priorities, welfare spending, how they themselves have see themselves. So we'll come back to that. The specific issue of disinvestment, you said they didn't meet their target. There's an even bigger argument about whether government should be investing from its assets the way it has stated itself to. And, in Parliament, for instance, and I'd like your perspective on that, because Rahul Gandhi, for instance, said, previous governments created X number of PSUs. This government has got rid of 23 PSUs, hasn't even made a single one. So, I mean, that's a bigger issue. Like, there's a lot of argument over whether that asset monetization should happen or should not happen. Is disinvestment something government should do, not do? So, for lay people, first, we'd like to understand whether this should happen in the first place or not.
For lay people, let me explain something to you. You have a child, and that child says that I want to sing. Should that child learn to sing or play the violin? If that child is incompetent at learning how to sing and cannot sing, I don't think I'm going to enter into a futile argument whether the child should be going to singing class or not. If you can't disinvest, I told some of my friends from within this government, there are forces in this government, the Swadeshi people who I work with a lot and I like, who said that, we are worried about the disinvestment, we will be underselling assets. I told them this last year, I said in Hindi, I said to them, Inki shamta nahi. When they show me they can disinvest, come and talk to me about disinvestment. It's a bit like, you may wish to win elections in UP as an opposition party. If I know you're not going to win the election, I'm not going to waste my time speculating on what you're doing in UP. And that one is straight for the Congress. So I'm very bipartisan about incompetence. So why are we having this silly debate about whether they should be disinvesting or whether they're not, because they cannot?
Okay, I'm going to come back to that. There's just so many aspects to all of this.
No, I want to also make a very quick point. I think our parliamentarians have been very, very silly and immature, the opposition parliamentarians. Here you have a definite accountability problem within government. They have missed their target by 1 lakh crores, and you're talking about whether or not you should have disinvestment. That's not a job a responsible opposition does. First say, you are not doing what you said, and this is very important for India or for any state. Remember, the ability of a state to call itself an effective functioning state depends not just on having an effective army and an effective home ministry, which I suppose it is in some ways, at least with respect to old people and young children, but also an effective finance ministry. And the fundamental, how do I put it? The fundamental identity of a state is its ability to collect taxes and manage its public resources. When it fails to do that, it's not missing a target. When it fails to do that in substantial measure, I begin to think late Mughal Empire. I begin to think Ottoman Empire. I hope your public gets the history, and maybe economics is complicated. Remember that all nation states in the world have failed and collapsed principally when they have been unable to mobilize resources to run the state in substantial measure. And that is what is happening in our country today, which is why it's a very serious issue.
So Rathin, here again, I'm just thinking from the perspective of a lay audience, because so much of this conversation happens, it's like tech conversations, it's all impacting, changing our lives, and yet we don't really understand what's going on. So there's such deep polarization, Rathin, that, here's you very animatedly and passionately saying the government is incompetent because it's unable to meet its tax targets. But if I was listening to another economist, and that could be Shamika Ravi, who was also part of the PM's advisory council, or Sanjeev Sanyal, or, even Sajid Chenoy of JP Morgan, or like innumerable others, the sense is that actually the government had very buoyant tax revenues last year, and that's been one of the success stories of the government, that it met its tax revenues. So, I mean, the polarization has reached so deep that one doesn't even know, like, I can't like really churn out facts and figures. So I really want an honest assessment, like who's telling me the truth on this,
Okay, I'll let your audience judge. Till last year, the government said that it would try and collect between 8 and 8.5% of GDP as tax GDP ratio. It was collecting that in the early part of this administration, the first administration, post 2014 till 2016. It then kept insisting it would collect so much, and it did not manage to do so year after year after year, causing in effect what I've called in the past a silent heart attack. Because you see, when you don't collect taxes, then you have to spend less. But if you want to pretend that you're spending more, then you lie to the public, and that is what has been happening. Last year, they crashed their target from 8 to 6. I'll explain it to your audience in a minute. This is my view. You can 2 to 7. And this year they've gone up to about 7.3, 7.4 between the target and the actuals. But next year they've reduced it to below 7.4. So they're targeting very modestly now. And I admire their modesty, but I think but the modesty is a consequence of incompetence. It is like saying that a child says, I'll come top of my class. And the child doesn't come top of the class, and therefore the child is relegated to the 3rd division. And then the child says, I came 3rd class first. If you think that's competence, fine. I have higher standards. I don't want to comment on what my fellow economists think. And on disinvestment, there is no argument. There is simply no argument. They have failed
on the disinvestment
frightening measure. As a result of which, let me point out to your audience that the fact that they're saying that they have had an expansionary budget post-COVID is a lie, because total expenditure as a proportion of GDP has shrunk as a consequence of this failure to raise revenues by 1.5%. The size of government spending today is at its smallest since the middle of this decade. At a time when, and what has therefore suffered? Narega has suffered, healthcare has suffered, public goods expenditure has suffered, welfare statements. They have not suffered because the government has chosen to increase public investment. They have suffered because the size of the state has had to be shrunk. And on top of that, the government has chosen to do public investment. If you had 1 lakh crores from disinvestment, you would not have cut Narega. If you had 1 lakh crores from disinvestment, you would not have cut health. And therefore, it is very important for people to understand the consequences of incompetence and not to get into battle of panipat mode of discussing what is and should be a national crisis as if it is business as usual. Do not, please, fall into the trap that Mohammad Shahangila did.
Okay, so, I don't want to lose our audience. I want to go about this conversation in a structured way. Since you're raising incompetence, as there's the whole issue of inequity, of widening divide between the rich and the poor, and there's some really startling statistics there. So I want to address all of that. But since you're raising competence as the big red flag, you were part of the ministry in a certain way because you were part of the PM's advisory council. Where do you think the heart of the problem from your perspective lies? Like, what's the big gap that's built up? What is so different about this finance ministry from previous ones? Because I'll just add one more point to that in the past, no matter how politically disparate governments are, on an economic front, by and large, ever since the big break of 1991, successive governments have by and large walked the same path. There's a kind of overall long way, a mixed economy path that all governments have walked, greater or lesser competence. What is so different about this finance ministry? And
this level of revenue mobilization failure is unprecedented in the history of India.
But they might quote the pandemic to you as being the...
No, this revenue mobilization failure starts in 2016 with taxes. And last I knew, and this reflects incompetence, when this budget was framed last year in February, the pandemic was on. And now what are you saying? You missed the target by 1 lakh plus crores because of the pandemic. You didn't know that in March. I don't pay you to do that. Sorry. You don't get a free pass.
So
your IAS officers and some alleged economists, presumably selected for competence. I'm part of the professional economics thing. And if I take revenue calls, I don't get them wrong by 1 lakh crores. So that's a wash. I don't understand why. I'm not saying you. Everyone is trying to make excuses for this government.
No, not at all.
This is unacceptable. A 1 lakh crore hole is, you talked about suffering. 1 lakh crores is the suffering that is being caused by not being able to put money into welfare while pursuing your public investment objective. I have no objection. we can go into the details of that public investment push. I have no particular objection to your pursuing one strategy or the other. So whether you want to follow a mixed economy or not, you said you want to disinvest. I noticed you said you wanted to disinvest only when you couldn't collect taxes. That I noticed. But I let that pass. Okay, fine. You can't collect taxes. You want to disinvest? Get the money. Be a state. Perform the basic functions of a state. A grown-up state. Don't sit there in North Block making excuses to the tune of 1 lakh crores 1 year after you have miserably failed in your task. I think that change in competence has also been caused by weak political authority. Weak. Contrast the finance ministry with the home ministry. Contrast the finance ministry with the home ministry. Whatever you might agree or disagree with the home ministry, they have extremely strong political authority, at least with women and children, old people, and Jammu and Kashmir, and Article 370 and the temple and that sort of thing. We may not agree with their decisions. That is, I won't comment on because that's not the subject of this, but they exercise authority. There is a chain of command, it works. That is not true of the finance ministry. One day it says it wants to increase expenditure, instead of that it cuts it. One day it says it is unable to give me even a medium-term prognosis of the economy. The Niti Aayog goes around doing things. I'm talking about the economic establishment in general, from artificial intelligence one day to labor market reform the other day, then commenting on statistics the third. Anything except give me a medium-term, what I used to get from the Planning Commission, a medium-term blueprint. Okay. They failed to do GST compensation and then ask the states to borrow. There's no coherent idea about how the federal structure works. Because they're poor, they steal money from the states. This your readers may not know, but the moment you call a tax assess, you don't have to share it with the states under the constitutional formula. They have been stealing money from the states now for 4 years continuously. All signs of a collapsing center, very late Mughal Empire. And that is the incompetence you're seeing in economic management, because in my view, at the political level, there may be a political vision on many things. There is no economic vision. That is now crystal clear. Telling me $5 trillion is not an economic vision, with great respect.
Yeah,
I mean, that Leonid Brezhnev could do that. That's a target. Kim Il-sung can do that. Kim Jong-il can do that. So North Koreans do. They set targets. But how are you going to achieve it? What are the structural changes you're going to bring about?
We spoke about this issue of taxes. So that is something that has been exercising everyone. Let me ask you on that there was great dismay across the board that, that the government didn't give any tax breaks to the middle class, to the professionals, to the lower half of the pyramid. And Sanjeev Sanyal responded with great annoyance, actually, to a TV anchor who was asking him why there were no tax breaks for the suffering middle class. And he said, where do you want us to raise money from? Or what do you want us to spend less on? So my question there to you, he's not sitting here, is that was it feasible for the government, as far as I know as a lay journalist, not an economic journalist, is that they gave corporate tax breaks to the tune of 1.2 lakh crore when they brought it down from 30% to 22%. Do you think that was a correct decision? And right now, given that the wealthy, the top 10%, the top 100 billionaires have literally burgeoned, the statistics is that the top 10%, the top 100 billionaires today have 57% of the country's wealth. Mr. Adani's wealth has gone from 8 billion to 30 billion in the last 8 months, when the rest of India has been sliding into poverty. Then is a wealth surcharge not justified? Could the government have raised more taxes through the super rich? And was that a big missed opportunity? What's your perspective on giving tax?
You actually asked me 3 questions. So let me answer the first about Sanjeev. I saw that interview, or snippets of it, and I think she was gabbling on about Mahabharata shlokas or something. It was a long day, and I completely sympathize with Sanjeev getting a bit tired of this nonsense. But you keep Dafa company, you're going to have to tolerate. So she's not exactly anyway. And what he said was actually not really the point. The point in India is, in fact, everyone should read Rukmini's book on this. I've just been reading it. You and I are not middle class. My driver is not middle class. Do you know? Let me give you a number. So your readers will understand, your viewers will understand per capita income, right? That's the average income of an Indian. Do you know in the UK, if you earn the average income of the UK, you are taxed. You are taxed if you earn 1/3 the average income of the UK. the per capita income. In Brazil, slightly poorer, you are taxed at 70% of the per capita income. In India, you have to earn 4 times the per capita income, 400% to be taxed. Why? Because we are a very poor country. So our middle class does not pay taxes in the first place, direct taxes. That is, if you talk of the middle class as those in the middle of the income distribution, only the top 4% of the population of this country pay income tax. So if you're asking for a tax cut for the top 4%, all these people in Gurgaon, putting on their pressure cookers and tube lights, and driving to malls, I'm afraid they are in the top 4%. They might not feel they are. Culturally, I'm sure they're not. But economically, I'm sure they are. And you can't cut taxes on the middle class because they don't pay taxes. So that's number 2. So Sanyal and this. A wealth tax. No, they actually asked me 4 questions. Corporate tax. Of course, it was an egregious error to not pick up, again, I'm not blaming the finance ministry. I already told you they're incompetent. You can't expect them to pick up these things. This requires a little bit of sense. So let me explain to your viewers. Last year, what happened in the country? GDP fell. GDP fell, did not grow less, fell, gira. If it fell, it means that less was produced and consumed. If less was produced and consumed, that means companies, I'm talking about any company, formal, informal, other than healthcare and maybe IT, who were producing stuff, were producing less. That includes a lot of what Adani, Ambani, Tata, whoever. But you know what happened?
The massive.
You know what happened. The stock market boomed. Of course, all of you know what happened. The so-called middle class who invest in the stock market, it boomed. How did it boom? When we were producing less? Because those who were producing less were earning more despite producing less. Because wages fell, returns to capital fell, profits went up in 80 listed companies. So if you're going to, and therefore this investment, you see why it has fallen is, if I'm able to do dhanda by producing less and making more money, why should I invest? Why should I sell more? I'll sell less and make more money. It's easier than selling more, no? I have to do supply chain, I have to hire people. Who wants to do all that? Sell less, go and play golf or whatever Adani does. So in those circumstances, it was absolutely right to impose, in fact, a windfall tax on profits. And the justification is you made less, you made more money. Everybody else has suffered by making less money because we made less. It's not their fault that they suffered. There was a pandemic, but in this pandemic, you benefited. There's a global debate, which the finance ministry is totally unaware of, I'm sure, because I don't know what they read. Then we should have been taxing windfall profits. It was done in the UK. It was done in many countries. We did not do that. And so, yes, we could have taxed windfall profits temporarily and then had a conversation about how these people would start doing what I expect capitalists to do. I'm not a communist. I don't particularly like public sector activity. I expect capitalists to make more, be productive, hire more people, sell more in the market. Not to make less, hire fewer people, sell less in the market, and make more money. If I'm going to do that, I'm going to tax. Okay? And as it is incentive. They didn't do that. The wealth tax, finally, is, I think, as Mahatma Gandhi said about Western civilization, is a very good idea. In the sense that in practice, it is very difficult to implement. So you see, let's say Shoma's wealth, what wealth? You own that house you're sitting in, I presume, right? I try and tax you annually on the basis of that house. Let us assume you do. So there are many ways you could say it is not your house. So you see, if I want to tax your wealth, I can't tax the wealth you have. Whereas when I tax your income, I can tax the income you have. Unless I become really draconian and say, if you're not going to pay that tax and no one wants to pay that tax, I'm going to take over that house. So taxing wealth in principle is very difficult. It is much better to tax the drivers of wealth, the principal one of which is windfall profits. The second is rents, right? And through that, moderate wealth inequality.
So this brings us to the really, really big glaring issue, because a lot of this, I told you that, largely from a perspective where I want our audience and myself actually to understand, who's right in this, or is there any kind of objective truth in this, or is this really about polarized perspectives? Because if there was someone who was, more from the government's perspective sitting here, the things I've been hearing them praise themselves for, and even like I quoted Sajid Chinoy, a sober economist with JP Morgan, his point was that they had many complex issues to deal with. and they've managed to have a great forex reserve. They've had to walk this balance between, expenditure and revenue, and also to create private investment, and really what is growth, and et cetera, et cetera. And the things the government is congratulating itself on is to kind of have kept control on fiscal deficit, have spent on welfare, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going into that. What I want your perspective on, and that they've spent on the green economy, et cetera, that they've been inclusive and looking at technology, green economy, crypto, so looking at some of the futuristic stuff, et cetera. But the one, I think, absolute objective fact here is that there is huge inequity building up, and that there is a great divide, there's great distress. That's what I want you to also address, that, this is, like you've been saying again and again, is a very politically strong government. It has a massive mandate. It could be very populist. It wants to win elections. So why then has its expenditure on health come down by 6%, on education come down by 6%? According to Oxfam, expenditure on health has come down by 10%, on social spending from 1.4% of GDP to 0.6% of GDP. 40 million people have gone into extreme poverty. They're just crazy statistics going around. 6 million MSMEs have died off. What was it? 1/5 the population income has gone down by 53%. These are very, very stark figures. So why then would a very, very powerful political government that wants to win elections not have been more populist? Like Abhijit Banerjee has been saying that, Mr. Chidambaram, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, so many have been saying, let them print money, doesn't matter about the fiscal deficit, create income support. Why is this government not doing it? And that's the original question I asked you. What do you think its vision is? And why is it secure in that vision? Because it's a politically astute government.
You're making a number of assumptions there, which I don't agree with.
Okay.
But you are, as to Sajid, you have to ask.
I should say an electorally astute government.
Yeah, all right. Well, yeah. In fact, the answer is contained in what you just said. The difference between astute and electorally astute. Because there is one. But anyway, as far as what Sajid and others say, you've just provided me the answer. I'm not an accountant or an economic bureaucrat or somebody only interested in the fate of bond markets. And neither I know with some approval is the finance secretary who said, I'm not here to please the bond markets. So if the government is sort of doing a nice finessing job of X and Y and, completely failing to either improve jobs, prosperity, or welfare spending in a time of crisis, I don't really see how anyone can say he's doing a good job. It's just common sense. I don't understand. I don't really want schoolboy excuses for failure. Being dressed up as is doing a good job, because I'm telling you what the truth is, they are incompetent. And you should not, as an Indian citizen, accept incompetence on part of your government. Please, we have become a nation with very low standards in Bombay and elsewhere. So the answer to that is yes, everything you said is true. We are much worse off today, either in welfare terms or in growth terms. Let me give you an idea of the challenge in simple growth terms. People are talking about we have gone back to zero. So suppose the pandemic had not happened. You know how much we were growing at the year before the pandemic?
Yeah,
3.5%.
3%. Yeah.
Yeah. That is the lowest growth rate that I can remember since I was almost in short trousers. Okay. That's a long time. I'm in my early 50s. So, I was in my short trousers a really long time ago. That kind of growth rate is a very modest growth rate. And then we go negative. Now, if you say, suppose the pandemic had not happened, what would it take us to go back to that modest growth rate? Just that modest growth rate. Not what it would take us to go back to zero, which is what we have done this year. The answer is we need about 7% growth over the next 5 years. This government hasn't achieved anything close to 7% growth since 2016. And I see no plan. I see no plan at all. I see no discussion of this number, which anyone can figure out, coming from the Ministry of Finance. On top of that, you have what is called pandemic scarring. We won't go into ancient history. What you said about printing money, etc., is absolutely true. But I have some sympathy for the government, as I did say, I think, on Karan Thapar's show. I think they know they're not capable of doing it, you see. They know that if they get all those resources, they cannot spend them. They know they can't build even the Prime Minister's favorite bullet train. They know that they're completely stretched out on roads, even Mr. Gadkari knows. They know that they're not competent to complete and finish infrastructure projects on time. They know. And they know that their ability to target fiscal spending, especially in urban areas, is severely limited, unless they're willing to work with lower level authorities, i.e. municipal governments, panchayats, and state governments, which they don't want to do because they're politically astute, you see. That political astuteness requires them to override electoral interest over the national interest, and electoral interest is not in working cooperatively with the state governments, because unfortunately, the electorate has chosen to elect a majority of non-BJP state governments. So they will not work with the states. So they will not have the capacity to scale up spending in the way you say. So they do nothing.
So I'm going to come, this is very important. There has been a lot of heated debate over this whole, again, it's very interesting. Mr. Stalin, Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, started that he's going to stop calling it the center and call it the union. PTR has brought that up. And of course, Rahul Gandhi made that big statement in Parliament. I'm going to come back to this whole federal fault line that's developing, but stick with the inequity issue a little bit more, Rathin. You have established, and I'm not arguing that, I'm not competent to, that this government has been extremely incompetent, and you've laid out why you think so. But my question is that two things here. One is that if all these indices are true, and we've just seen the railway job riots, and that 20 million people applied for 140,000 jobs, we know unemployment rates are high. And again, I want to remind our viewers that unemployment rates were at a 40-year high even before the pandemic. As you said, GDP growth had come down to 3% before the pandemic. So, very often now, again, we get confused that is the government constrained because of the pandemic years, and you can't be harsh with them on that. So let's set aside the pandemic. Let's look at pre-pandemic. But this inequity has been growing all the time, So now put yourself as in, say, Nirmala Sitharaman's shoes. What would you have done, Rathin, to have kept the economy in control, managed all the complex things a finance minister has to manage, and not allowed this divide to happen? Give me some specific things of what you
Very
would
easy. First, I would have acknowledged that the economy is not in control. I wouldn't have pretended to the Prime Minister that the economy is in control and everything is all is well, as they used to say in that movie. And that has become a culture. To tell a Prime Minister who is increasingly out of touch with the economic fortunes of this country that all is well. I've seen it repeatedly happening when I was at the PMEC, including the tax policy failure. Things I had warned about were poo-pooed away with the Prime Minister's office. And his understanding of these matters being somewhat limited, and his access to good quality external advice being even more limited, he is unable to get frank advice because he prefers platitudinal advice. But that is something that the voters have selected, and they must live with it. So assuming I had a Prime Minister who would actually listen, which is a big if, there are 5 things that I would immediately do in the short term. One, I would have done the windfall tax, right? Immediately. 2, I would have got serious about privatization, and I would have asked the states and the private sector to join me in creating the national privatization and asset monetization pipeline. And gone to the top 10 industries who made windfall profits and said, tell me what you can commit to in terms of privatization over the next 3 years. That is the first thing I would have done to basically shore up on the revenue front. In addition to that, on the revenue front, what I could have done is gone in for a hypothecated borrowing program, the proceeds of which I would have given as grants to the states, devolved that money to the states and asked them to increase welfare expenditure. Why would I give them grants? Because states are good at welfare expenditure because it's revenue expenditure, and that would not then constrain them. So I would not have gone down this capital expenditure route at all. This is the wrong time to be doing it. Now the time has come to increase aggregate demand, but these would have been short-term measures. These measures would have reduced or at least alleviated some of the suffering we are seeing. In the long term, I would need to have a growth strategy that, in my view, and there can be many views. I think a lot of what I've said, I would very aggressively say that I'm actually right. Here I am expressing an opinion which I think is right, but there could be counter views, and I respect them. My major diagnosis of what is wrong with this economy and why we are getting so unequal has to do with the fact that the middle class doesn't pay income tax. because they're too poor, not because they won't, because they're too poor. But people who earn the minimum wage or twice the minimum wage have a lot of demand. But their demand is not what drives the high frequency indicators of the Indian economy in Bombay. Bombay looks at four-wheeler sales, FMCG, airline sales, things like that. What people who earn the minimum wage or twice minimum wage want to buy without subsidy, then they should be earning a minimum wage, buying is a decent meal, clothes, an affordable house, but not with subsidy, no charity. I go out there, I take an EMI, I buy a 5 lakh house. Good quality healthcare, good quality education. Producing the 5 things that the people of India want close to where they want it, and these are easily decentralized, will allow people to be able to consume the things they want, and that will create employment. You don't have to worry about artificial intelligence. When it comes to agriculture, a 400 rupee shirt, but what are you instead seeing? Agriculture is a mess because we're not allowing farmers the autonomy to make a profit and sell things at affordable prices to people. And by the way, everything I'm pointing out now is a bipartisan failure which will need to be fixed, because this is what is wrong with our 1991 growth story. Shirts, cheap clothing. This shirt, Marks and Spencer, 3,000 rupees. 95% made in India. Try and buy a 300 rupee shirt, over 85% made in Bangladesh and Vietnam. The demand of the minimum wager is leaking out. We are only able to satisfy the demand of the rich. Affordable housing, government is not able to contribute its biggest asset, land, to lower the cost of housing and to then create the financial structure that will enable small ticket lending to happen for the 5 lakh, 10 lakh units that people in the minimum wage can afford, which would wipe out slums in India. It's such a great opportunity in the next 5 or 10 years. And I've done blueprints of this for Bombay and Pune. I can do them for other cities, Bangalore. I can do them for other cities too. And I've done it earlier. But unfortunately, vested interests mean that these things are not possible. Education, the less said, the better. We have a social problem there, so I won't go there. And we have a healthcare. Healthcare, obviously, we have failed the country. And I would not have failed them. I would have had a healthcare blueprint in place. And you would have seen in this budget, if I were the finance minister, a large, detailed and articulated plan blessed by the kind of healthcare experts who have steered us through the pandemic to make sure that we reduce disease burden and reduce and provide essentially affordable health. Again, 5 things that would at least, if this constituted 60 to 70% of our growth in the next 5 years, and 20% came from exports, we can attain 8% growth, increase employment, improve welfare. We are making exactly the opposite choices. We are investing in stuff that the rich will use, and we are borrowing from them to pay for it. We are unable to collect the taxes and receipts that we say we will collect to finance these things, and we don't have a plan. So the 3 things we need to do is collect the resources, be clear about what you're going to invest in and what the results are, commit to those results and be accountable for success and for failure, and stop talking in the future continuous tense, talk in the present tense. That's a bad Indian habit which this government has in spades, and it must stop. If you did these 3 things, you would resolve the economy. But there is one final thing I want to say. This would not be electorally astute.
Why is that?
Let me give you the example of education. I do not think that in India, it's a social problem we have. So there's no point going on blaming the state beyond a point. People are not interested in education. People are interested in credentials to get jobs. The two can and not to overlap, but they cannot be distinct. It cannot be that you're uninterested in the quality of development of the mind of your children, and you're only interested in them as factors of production. Unfortunately, our entire attitude to education from school to college to tertiary, quota reflects it so well, has become that. When I tweeted about this 6 months ago, a number of people wrote to me, people in India are rude when they're disempowered, rudely, saying, what are you talking about? Of course, education is all about making income. What else is it about? If you have this kind of fundamental social misunderstanding of education, then you can't do much. The second reason it is not electorally astute is that there is no social movement or political movement, despite all this suffering, in any part of this country that would cause a government politically or propel it to take decisions to end the kind of economic misery that we are seeing and to reverse course. There are other kinds of movements which bring electoral reward, but not on the economic front. What lesson do you expect the politicians to learn from that? So the fault lies with us.
So in fact, that's again where I'm really, as a journalist, and, I have my political views, but I want to be bipartisan on this, that if there is this level of suffering, Rathin, then, why is it not expressing itself, it is in riots, occasional flare-ups, in that sense, there has been, but not like, the previous government, the UPA 2, was brought down on 2-3 ideas, of corruption, crony capitalism, and the economy. Earlier, if onion prices rose a little bit, there was feet on ground. But this is why I'm going on asking you is there something that commentators are missing, which the government is getting right, in which people are feeling looked after, and we're all just talking in an echo chamber, And so just for a moment, if you set aside your differences with the government, is there something that they are achieving in terms of delivery to people that we are missing? For instance, right now I was telling you that if there were people from the government's perspective, they would count the fact that they have a big scheme on housing. It's not the route that you're suggesting, which is not subsidized housing, but creating enough low-cost housing that people can buy with dignity and creating the infrastructure around it. But even in terms of a welfare scheme, they're focusing on housing, on bringing water to people, good or bad, the sanitation and toilet creation scheme. And of course, the gas cylinder thing is something we need to really examine, because the second gas cylinder is not something that most households are being able to afford. But what is it that, if like I'm surprised as a journalist, I'm no longer on the ground, but I keep thinking that if all these figures are true, why is it not bubbling up more, and forcing itself to become the political agenda?
There are two interlinked reasons for this, in my view. Other than the Communist Party of India, I'm giving them a long pass. Can you identify a single ideological party in this country? So take something like AAP. Okay, what is it? It's a transactional party. It's the kind of dream that an IIT engineer who has never read a word of politics in their life and wouldn't know ideology if it jumped on him or her in a dark night would think is what good government is about. It's about closing the circuits to provide better service delivery. Now, if you're going to play that game...
But in fairness to the AAP's governance in Delhi, they have focused on schools, on health.
But they have no, you're not getting my point. They have no ideology. They are trying to make things work better, right? And therefore, it's a bit like a Mohalla committee politics. There's no ideology. So if you ask her, what is your vision for an 8-year-old in Delhi, living in Delhi in 2040? No, not interested. Only want to Mohalla committee. I want to fix Delhi government school. The results are not all that. Again, if you have low standards, you would like all this. India is a country of low standards. I just have to have high aspirations for my country. I'm a patriot, you see. You're getting a few people half-educated at Delhi government schools, they get a clerk's job. It's not my idea of educating a child, with respect. Anyway, which is why actually the best education initiatives in this country have not come from government. They've come from social movements. Again, because there was an ideology of education historically. Anyway, let that pass. The BJP does have an ideology. And it is an ideological party. Elections are fought, as you rightly said, on ideas. And it is only when you do not have ideas that people fight elections on negative facts. So indubitably, this government has been politically astute in the sense it's made an ideating offer to the people, which has nothing to do with their social welfare or their economic transformational aspirations, right? On top of that, what you then need, in my view, is enough delivery to prove that you are instrumentally better at the non-ideological business than you are, than any possible opponent. Now, that has not worked for them unambiguously. Very simply, if you take an efficient...
I didn't get that point. What are you saying there?
अगर मुझे आपको पैसे देना है, आपके मुंह पे पैसे फेंकना है, if I want to throw money at you as charity, as the wretched of the earth, and that is what you want from a government, that is the limit of your aspiration. First, I have to sell you the idea that this should be the limit of your aspiration. Okay, you can start by saying, and you have to admit that the BJP has done that very well because it's a cadre-based party. So they have used their political cadres, just like the DMK does very effectively, for example, in Tamil Nadu, to provide not public goods. So governments provide three things, right? They provide, the best thing a government can do is provide opportunities and transform. The second thing a government can do is provide public goods to help those opportunities happen: health, education, women's empowerment. The third is to give handouts, social welfare. One of the three things you have to do, and the easiest to do, is social welfare, especially when you're trying to unite society, not around the economic aspiration, but something else. Then I say I give you, 2 gas cylinders, 3 liters of petrol, 5 kilos of rice, and the Ram temple. If you accept it, it is a winnable electoral strategy.
Rathin, I have to stop you here because I think you're making a very important point, and I want to just get some clarity on that.
Sure.
So again, in all fairness, there's so many, including me, but much more, just really competent economists, and also very capitalist, market-oriented economists like Mr. Chidambaram, Yashwant Sinha, etc., who have all argued for a really extended welfare state. And even Mr. Raghuram Rajan, I've challenged all of them, saying, when you all were in government, you used to poo-poo all the, Sonia Gandhi's National Advisory Council, etc., Narega, food security, all the welfare schemes. People were so opposed. Mr. Modi himself used to be so opposed. They've all stood in good stead. But I'm asking you a much more, foundational question, which is that we need welfare because people are in great distress. But your ultimate aim is not just to create a basic income or an income support. You really want people to stand on their own 2 feet, and create the circumstances for that. So I want to ask you, is something very terrifying happening in our country right now? I'm not anti-welfare. I think everyone needs a level playing field before they can stand on their own 2 feet. So I'm very pro-welfare. But my point is what you just said, that instead, are we creating a society where just getting the bare minimum is making people satisfied? I'm not talking about the moral hazard and all that, which market people speak about. I'm just saying, are we creating a psyche where there's such helplessness that you're okay with a little bit of ration, 1 toilet, 1 gas? And because even labor participation is falling, and I haven't understood that. Why do we have a huge youth demographic? And okay, there are no jobs, but why are there less people even looking for jobs? What's going on in our society? So just now, I just want you to get caught in the minutiae, Rathin. Can you help us just understand what is going on? Should we be following more aggressive welfare? For a moment, set aside the competence. Is the government correct in focusing on creating employment or livelihood, or they hope to create through capital expenditure, going the America route after the Depression? Forget the minutiae right now. Just help us understand what is the pathway that we should be following.
No, you see, it is not for me to determine the pathway. It is for me to have a point out that this country has been going since 1991 through a tremendous ideological vacuum. And the only ideologies you've had is the BJP's, which is an ideological party. I keep repeating, it's an ideological cadre-based party. But the thrust of its ideology is not economic transformation. I've often commented to my BJP friends that the one thing that, to an extent, I would argue Ambedkar, Indiaji, and Lohia agreed about, the Congress did not, was Antyodaya. You catch any BJP person who can even tell you today what Antyodaya means in the cabinet. I'll be certainly ask Mrs. Sitaraman. I'll be dead surprised if we can even explain it to me coherently. They can probably go and mug it up from a book. Their heart is not in it. Their heart is not in an aspiration of collective economic transformation and empowerment. But their heart is ideologically in many other things. Now, the trouble is, there is no alternative political formation whose heart is in that collective economic transformation either. The Indian voter is not stupid. They're not intelligent as a collective, but they're not stupid. This sort of transactional bargaining the Indian voter has seen for a long time. What they have not seen is an opportunity to unify around an ideology that gives them hope that a certain project of nation building in the areas they understand all too well, in the social sphere, in the community sphere, will happen. And that there is a government who is prepared to do so and and if it is iterative about it, so be it. To that, you have to add a government that is able to provide you, as I said, with handouts. And to that, you have to add that nobody from Mr. Chidambaram to Mr. Manmohan Singh, to anybody in the Congress party, has the faintest idea how to fix the things that would otherwise really matter ideologically, like education problem. This is a bipartisan failure, like a health problem. You were saying, when I asked this question to the Congress party when I was a young man in 2008, I came to work in the Finance Commission. I said, why do we have a Narega when we are growing at the fastest rate that we were in ever? I was poo-pooed, so you don't understand. It's about entitlement, blah, 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 blah. But my question was not against the NREGA. My question was, why do we need an NREGA when we have been growing as fast as we are? So party after party has shown the lack of a coherent vision of economic prosperity and transformation to put before the people. The BJP too does not, but let me remind you that the Prime Minister came up with an incoherent vision, and that was good enough in 2014 to some extent to supplement and buttress. That has now been abandoned, but the rest of the ideology has moved. And to that he has added more effective service delivery, I'll just give you a sentence because it's important to understand the whole of India here, than his counterparts in the states where the BJP has won state elections also. And in the most important state where this has happened, Uttar Pradesh, is sufficient for the BJP's electoral math to work and for them to run the country. Where regional parties have been able to counter the BJP with an alternative value proposition, such as Tamil Nadu or Andhra or Telangana, the BJP has not won. Or it has been insecure in its victory, such as Karnataka, right? Or Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan. But here we are just talking AAP-style government. So I would say that that is the problem, that if by 2024 we do not see the coming together of a coherent offer to the young people in this country of a socio-economic transformation and an ideology that backs it, there is no reason for me to vote anybody other than the BJP. Why would I?
Yeah, God. You know, Rathin, we've been chatting quite a long while, and there's just so many aspects that I would like clarity. But, you know, this stuff gets everyone so het up that I just like, you know, I know that you have the capacity to create some, like, you know, I've been repeatedly pushing you to give us some pathway, a roadmap, you know, like, because what you just said, and I know even in earlier interviews with Mr. Chidambaram, I think from 1991, it's been apparent, and I'm not saying none of this liberalization, etc., should have happened. Middle class has expanded. A lot of people have been taken out of poverty, but the job creation has been very minimal in the formal sector. You know, I mean, right through this period, job creation has been very, very low. So there is now talk that the real zone of employment, job creation, even entrepreneurship will be in the MSME sectors, you know. So like what should be done there is one question. Like what is that focus? So again, I'm going on asking you now, we'll have to wrap up, though we haven't talked about many important things, but that if you were given a magic wand, you mentioned those 5 things, you would focus on housing, education, clothing, you know, health. Those are the things that people really want to consume. And so you'd create growth there. That's one big idea you've given. But on the other stuff, like on MSMEs, on this whole informal sector, what would you do? One question. And secondly, because this government has now presented capital expenditure as its big vision, I want to ask you that if it is creating ports, highways, airports, I'm not going into the competency. I'm just saying that's their vision. They want to create that. But after you create that, you hand it over to private companies. Is that something a nation needs? I'm not saying government has to run it, but should they actually continue to own it and then lease it to someone to run? What are better models of doing this, you know?
On the first one, we won't have an informal sector if you follow my path. Because by definition, you cannot have an informal sector in health and education. In housing, if you're able to create the kind of demand that I'm suggesting, then what will have a supply chain where everyone will make money. And then logically, the degree of informality or smallness will be determined by how much money you make there and whether it makes sense for you to grow or to start multiple units. So then it becomes an artifact. SMEs don't create jobs. SMEs create jobs because the activities that should be creating jobs are not creating jobs. Therefore, we are conflating a form of organization with job creation, right? It is activities that create jobs. And then the form that the activity takes, I'm enough of a market-friendly economist to say that the form that activity takes, if you can eliminate rent seeking, if you can eliminate thuggery, if you can eliminate these things, will be, I'll give you an example in a minute, will be determined by the market. So let me put it this way. You cannot make these 400 rupee shirts I was talking about in Gujarat or Tamil Nadu where these shirts are made because wage costs are too high related to Bangladesh and Vietnam. You can make them in Eastern UP, you know. You can make them in Bihar. I've done the research. We'll be competitive. But my entrepreneurs don't want to set up units there. Socioeconomic, sociology is not going to let you go. So we have to crack that problem, and an economist can only tell you that you can do it in UP and Bihar, rather than sit down and understand what social conditions inhibit me. It's not a lack of skills, because 25% of the shop floor making these shirts are people from UP, Bihar, Bengal, and Jharkhand. It's when they go back. I have my own theories. It's too short a time to tell you about this. So that is what I feel about the question you just asked about, what would I do next? What was your last question? Sorry.
About the capital expenditure on creating big assets.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. This is going to. I hope you don't get annoyed. Forgive me. I have been a teacher, and I'm not interested in the class duffer telling me to weigh the pros and cons of what will happen if the class duffer succeeds in doing something that the class duffer claims he will do, but I have evidence for 8 years that they will not.
You made the point about competence.
We will cross the bridge. I want to see the investment first. I want to see those routes. I want to see those 400 Vande Bharat trains. I have heard too much big talk from this government and previous ones, but particularly from this government, because it comes with a sense of hubris, which is very dangerous for a government that is sitting in late Mughal Empire mode. It's a terrible sin to be hubristic when your state is so weak. And I'm saying the state is weak on the economic side. So show me those trains, and then we'll have a debate on whether we privatize or not. First, put the trains there. Till then, I ain't talking. I want to see those trains. I haven't seen them for 7 years. I haven't seen nothing for 7 years. I want to see them.
Right. Rathin, I wish I could talk to you for another hour, because I actually want to pin you down on so many, bubbling.
But one thing I want to tell your readers, don't give the government a free pass. It's very seductive. It's an old political trick, which we as economists who work in policy do. We will take you into debates, jo fazool hai. Whether we should be public sector driven or private sector driven, opposition also falling that trap. How can you be driven by anything when you can't do anything? First do. Then we'll decide. We have the luxury of deciding whether it should be publicly owned or privately owned. Make the banks work. Then we'll decide whether they should be in the private sector or public sector. They're not working. Why am I having a debate about what the form of banking should be tomorrow? We are talking about cryptocurrency here, where we haven't even completed our, proper digital outreach. Do you know how many people in this country have smartphones? And then we're talking big shot about digital. So I really want these things to be completed and finished before we start talking about what's and ifs in a world which people would like to pretend India is. Seen this all my life. We are not. We are a poor, inadequate, badly governed country with a fairly weak state, a decrepit police force, and where law enforcement happens in the breach. We have to try and change these things to be able to deliver better, and that is where we should focus. We are not even Indonesia today.
Yeah. No, about the digital, again, it's the divide, and again, to be fair, Rathin, it's not, in a country like India, you can't transform overnight, so again, it's unfair if we don't look at, there are many people who are feeling empowered
but a chattering class that spends much of the day babbling on about a cryptocurrency in the face of what you have just told me is out to lunch. First, get your digital, then we'll talk about crypto. I can understand the government's frustration. They have said something mildly speculative about it. And because we want to pretend that we are bigger than we are, we're going around talking about crypto.
Yeah, which is...
You have no bloody shape to, go even 1,000 miles towards becoming any kind of a crypto power. Give it up. Get everyone to get a smartphone first. You're right. Bring the digital device first. Then we'll talk about crypto.
Okay, just last point to end on. I want to go back to what we began with. What Stalin or PTR Tyagarajan have been raising, or what Rahul Gandhi said in Parliament. I asked you in the very beginning that what's the heart of the fault line with this government? If we talk about previous governments and what was wrong with them, it'll become too big a conversation. But is it really that the centralizing impulse of this government is so strong that it's actually the source of its incompetence as well? Because, like the fact that so many states are feeling shortchanged, that the government is allowing itself a 6.9 fiscal deficit, but states are locked into 3.5%. They're really cramping the space of the states to perform. Instead of grants, it's loans. Those loans are defined. So they're really creeping into the position of the states. So if you were to pinpoint, I'm not going into the political vision and what we disagree with the government. I'm sticking with the economy. What is the heart of that big rupture that's happening with this government?
Okay, I can answer this question in 1 minute. My timeline of the story is you have an increasingly weak and incompetent economic administration in the state government, in the central government. One of the ways that can be fixed is if you have political capital devoted to it. to fixing it, but it has not. Therefore, you have bureaucratic overreach and a series of economic disasters that have happened over the last 7 years, at least since 2016. Now you have to find a way out of this constant weakening. One of the ways out would have been to try and work more cooperatively, not just with the states, but also other actors in the private sector, etc. That is not feasible for this government because it cannot cede that sort of political space. And therefore, it does not do it. And therefore, that compounds the problem of weakness at the center. That has resulted in the lack of any economic vision whatsoever for the future. The most stark evidence of which, to recollect for your viewers, is that if you ask the government what is going to be my growth rate in 2025, they babble $5 trillion economy at you. They don't know what the growth rate is going to be. They don't know what the structure of the economy is going to be. There is no printed document in the government of India for the first time in post-independent India's history that doesn't tell me where I'm going to be 5 years from now. There is no plan. And that again is a manifestation of weakness. There cannot be a plan because you're too weak to execute, complete and finish. This is then compounded with even bigger talk in the future tense, on which the government gets a free pass because they each want to pretend that it's business as usual. When it's not, it's a very serious situation. And therefore, the government gets a further free pass, which is a very dangerous thing to give to a government that is already weak in the economic sphere. However, the government is not weak in every sphere that it is in. It is strong in other spheres because there is ideology there and there is political capital invested. The people of India ultimately have to decide collectively whether they want political capital invested in alternative areas. And the leaders of India, the so-called leaders of India, it is incumbent upon them to do what they're conspicuously not doing today, which is come up with that alternative ideology of economic transformation. Not talk about instrumental politics and welfare this and welfare that, but an alternative ideology of economic transformation. I wish them luck. And I strongly believe if they did that, the ruling party too would then get engaged in that business, and that would be an altogether more healthy state of affairs for the kind of India I want to see tomorrow than from the kind of India I fear I'm going to see tomorrow.
Thank you, Rathin. That's an important note to end on, and thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of opportunities to keep pursuing these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice talking to you.